Alright, y'all, a little over a month later, Alcaraz, Djokovic run it back, this time on grass. Obviously, this means we get 1 versus 2, and, the rankings are right now a reflection very clearly of who the two best players in the world are, and it's by some margin, I think, In 2023, with some exceptions, Nadal not being active this year and Medvedev, still being in the ballpark, I think, on hard courts, but you'd be hard-pressed to say that right now this year, Djokovic and Alcaraz aren't the two best players on hard courts, clay, and grass at the moment. And the fact that after a wonky year last year where so many of the events Djokovic couldn't play, we had to wait over a year to get Djokovic and Alcaraz to run it back after that classic in Madrid. It's pretty crazy that now, over the course of a little over a month, we're about to get our second match between them both in the business end of slams, and obviously tomorrow they will be contesting their first major final, for which I could not be more thrilled for. This is the best case scenario for sure. As far as a final in terms of intrigue and I would say likely quality as well. In my video at the beginning of the second week, I said that I think that there's only one scenario where I don't entertain it being a formality that Djokovic hoists up number 24 in an 8th Wimbledon on Sunday, and that was if this was the final that we got. And with both guys putting together fabulous tournaments and I think coming in at a great level, I think it absolutely should be a fantastic final we're in for. So let's get into a couple of X's and O's, try to hone in on what might favor who and who we like to come out victorious in this matchup. For starters, obviously, this match being on grass this time, you have to say it favors Novak Djokovic. Personally, I don't think, he's capable of producing a performance, or I don't think I've seen a performance from him on par on grass with, that 2015 final. But there's a great case to be made that, on average, Djokovic might be the hardest to beat on grass than he ever has been in this, Djokovic 3.0, I like to call it, stage of his career since he got back on track in 2018. His late career serve and volley improvements among, not losing as much of a step as, some of his contemporaries late into his career all play a part in that being the case. Obviously, the numbers speak for themselves. Hasn't lost on center court since the 2013 final, 10 years ago, and hasn't lost a match at Wimbledon, period, since 2017. And for starters, just in a vacuum, you would say that in this matchup, Djokovic has the advantage in both serving and returning. In Paris, I felt that maybe the clay might negate some of that, serve-return advantage, but to my surprise, it played a lot bigger factor, and Djokovic's gulf there in that match was a lot more apparent, even pre-Alcaraz cramps. And, on paper, if that played its part to a greater extent than expected on clay, you would expect that to only be amplified and be something that's even more in Djokovic's corner this time around on grass. And while that certainly might end up being the case, I think there is a bit of a caveat there where Alcaraz has, superseded expectations, obviously in a lot of different areas on grass this year, but this Wimbledon, the return has been huge for him. I would go as far as to say that his returning this tournament has been Djokovician. There have been 3 guys, leading up to this tournament that in a redlining Nicolas Iari, Matteo Berrettini, obviously, and then Daniil Medvedev in the semifinals, but, all 3 of their serves that are all a big part of them, getting on the front foot, and for Medvedev, it's his primary source of offense. But their first serves in particular, all of them were neutralized pretty much, and I'd go as far as to say that, aside from Djokovic, Alcaraz looks like the best first serve returner on tour by quite some margin. And as far as, returning leaders for the last year, I'm pretty sure statistically he is rated the best at the moment. Obviously, that's a little bit misleading, as Djokovic at this stage in his career, energy management takes a couple return games off occasionally. But as far as Alcaraz's figures for this season, they're drastically better than they were a year ago, and they were already excellent last year. And they completely back up, what you're seeing throughout the course of this year and, this tournament, where he's neutralized a couple of big servers, and also a Medvedev, who is also an excellent spot server. But Carlos, for the season, according to Tennis Abstract, he is breaking at a clip of 36.7%, and also winning 44% roughly of overall return points, which both are significantly up from what he put up last year, and the nearly 37% of return games where he's breaking is, albeit I've only really looked at the figures of the big three, but I haven't seen a figure for break percentage that high aside from Djokovic 2011. That was, I think, about 39%. So, that's just, it paints a picture of how high a level of returning Alcaraz is at this year thus far. Now, that being said, it's been established Alcaraz returning at galactic levels right now. On this surface, it's still hard to see Djokovic having a harder time breaking the Alcaraz serve than vice versa. Obviously, it's been established into his later years with, Goran in his coaching box. The Djokovic serve has aged like fine wine. On grass, it's been one of the hardest to read, and many a time it's gotten him out of trouble when he's needed it most. And going back to, not only the Roland Garros match a month ago, but also Madrid, there seemed to be some sustained stretches there where, particularly off the Djokovic first serve, getting a read on it and putting enough quality returns in play was a bit of an issue for Carlos. Madrid match seems a bit less relevant, but, the Roland Garros semi, even the first two sets, first set he was famously very uptight, very bound up, and, I think it showed most really in the return. Missed a lot of makeable returns, particularly on the second where he just didn't make Novak play. And that's something that especially can't happen on grass. Even in the second, once he loosened up a little bit, that 4 or 5 game love 40, the Djokovic serve was, I think the biggest, aiding factor in him finding a way back in that game. And if that's, some sort of a trend on clay, you can't help but think it'll only be amplified on grass. And as for the Alcaraz serve, I will say I feel like this surface definitely seems to assist its effectiveness. He got the memo after his kick serve was getting clubbed last year against Sinner. Now in the second this year, employing a whole lot more of body serves, even going big a lot on his second serves, and obviously getting a lot more mileage from the beginning of this grass court season, even in Queens, out of just bombing his flat serve, which, we've seen pace-wise he's capable of doing really effectively. And against everybody else, his adjustments and the body serve being a go-to have been effective. But I'm keen to see how that success translates to Djokovic, because obviously he's a completely different breed of return than anybody he's faced to this point. And Carlos has still had stretches, in just about every match except for the Holger one, where either the serve itself, with doubles or whatnot, got a bit loose, or he, himself just played a loose service game. Even in the Medvedev semi, where he was pretty much playing with his food for most of the match, that third set got broken twice, and, those kind of lapses are, the classic Djokovic. You give him an inch, he'll take it a mile. And, overall, ultimately we just circle back to, as far as serve return dynamics, Djokovic obviously has the advantage. I think there's a bit more nuance as far as how far the extent of that seem to be performing better on grass. The extent of that, on paper advantage with serve return, I think is mitigated quite a bit. But, in that arena, as it typically is these days, it's definitely still advantage Djokovic. From the baseline, though, I would go as far as to say that I feel like it's pretty much a wash. Before their Roland Garros match, I, was pretty insistent that Alcaraz is going to have the biggest weapon on the court. His forehand, obviously. Still, I would say that's probably the case here as far as ground strokes are concerned. But, from the baseline dynamics, Djokovic is probably going to look to do pretty much exactly the same thing that he did at Roland Garros. I called the Alcaraz forehand the biggest ground stroke on the court, but, that was pretty much insignificant because, as we've learned over the years, it's not really the linear power that's going to mess with Novak Djokovic. Particularly in the first set of that match, he was matching Alcaraz blow for blow, especially when it came to Carlos throwing pace at him, because, forehand to forehand, you threw pace at the Djokovic forehand, it was coming back with interest. And, that's typically the key with unsettling Carlos Alcaraz, and, Djokovic being someone that can stay tight to the baseline and hold his own. In Paris, that was his gateway to, robbing Carlos of time. And I do feel like oftentimes in a lot of Alcaraz's big matches, he's just come out trying to smoke the ball and, get himself in an early rhythm and out on the front foot. I've seen it, 2021 was super early, but he came out of the gates, on fire against Tsitsipas. It worked out for him then. Didn't work out as well for him against Berrettini, the 1-5 setter he's lost in Australia last year. Like in Paris, different situation there with the nerves being such a factor, but, the insistence on trying to come out and get on the front foot. Both times it made him super errant through the opening act of those matches. The Alcaraz forehand does have the necessary versatility to unsettle Djokovic in, ways other than just line drive linear power. I remember in my preview for their Roland Garros semi, I had said that, I thought Alcaraz does a great job varying the spins, varying the heights, just exploring different avenues to get that short ball where, most of the time it's toast. Anything that's short or hangs up to the Alcaraz forehand. And I thought that would be more of a factor in Paris, but obviously he came out super wound up there, more errant than usual, and, Djokovic, such a strong starter, as has been established in, again, the Djokovic 3-point era, that's been a trademark in these big matches, just comes out so strong, so sharp, and puts you behind the 8-ball early to where, there's no room to settle down. And so, taking out some of the intangibles, I'll hit on them later, but in a vacuum, I would go about this more like how Alcaraz did as he settled down a bit in the second set, constructing points more, vary the spins, vary the height with the forehand, and, notably, he's been hitting his slice tremendously this grass court season. In fact, against Medvedev, and for good reason, it was, definitely premeditated that he was going to slice with greater frequency, a lot greater frequency than usual. If he can continue to knife it the way he did in that match, that's another way, not only, to keep Djokovic's pace at bay, but, also to avoid some of those backhand-to-backhand rallies where you'd favor Djokovic. So all in all, again, I call this a wash. It's pretty much a draw as far as, baseline dynamics in my view. I think that this Wimbledon, Novak has been quite sharp. We've seen the same, trademark Djokovic clean baseline and, confident forehand game translate itself seamlessly into Wimbledon as well. You didn't expect anything else. I think, at this point, they're both about even at net as well. I will say it'll be interesting to see how the cat and mouse points play out. Obviously, that's a big fixture when Carlos Alcaraz is involved. But, to the naked eye at least, I don't think it's been a great drop shot tournament for him. He's still been going to it with the usual frequency, but, with him not hitting it, I think, up to his usual standards, and I think getting burned on them a little more than you're used to seeing from him, it'll be interesting to see how much of a factor that plays against still the best mover on the surface, and a Novak Djokovic who was ready for Carlos trying to engage him in those cat and mouse points in Paris, where, if memory serves me correct, I think Djokovic was getting the better of those exchanges a lot of the time. But overall, again, I think it's a wash once the ball is in play. And so with that out of the way, we got to talk about the intangibles. Starting with, of course, nerves. That was something that I personally was hit out of left field with. I didn't expect the occasion to be an issue for Alcaraz, but in hindsight, it does check out. I mean, that was, with the US Open final, the biggest match of his career to that point, and add on top of that, getting the first taste of the Novak Djokovic in a slam experience, there's just no way to simulate that kind of stress, that kind of pressure. And to me, that is what I mark up the physical collapse after 2 sets at RG2, because, the guy has spent the most time on court as a major winner, 3 straight 5-setters at the US Open, and there's no fluking that. Either your body holds up to that type of physical stress, or it doesn't. So when I look at those cramps, I'm looking at it more from the pressure and stress perspective. And I said it after the match. I felt like, that being the case, you would think that would be a good learning experience for Carlos Alcaraz. Having gotten that experience under his belt, I expect him to manage the occasion a whole lot better tomorrow. Obviously, it also helps. It's grass, and it's not an overly hot day, I don't think. So that on its own, you would think, makes for a less physical match. That being said, though, you'd be surprised if nerves weren't apparent at all tomorrow on the Alcaraz end. It's a Wimbledon final. He's 20 years old. For a lot of guys, that trophy is the most coveted prize in the entire sport. It just feels natural that, at some point that'll make you antsy. But on the flip side, as far as Djokovic is concerned, I honestly would argue that this time the pressure is more on Djokovic than it is Alcaraz. Now, with Novak having the slam lead now, triple career slam, all of that, he's literally achieved it all in tennis multiple times. So I don't think, the pressure being more on Djokovic than Alcaraz, that's pressure that's going to, make Djokovic unsettled. But I'm just saying that from the standpoint of here, it feels like it's kind of flipped from what it was in Paris, where I would say, the slight majority were saying Alcaraz would win that match. In this case, in spite of the fabulous tournament Alcaraz has put together, still I would lean that Djokovic is a heavier favorite here than Carlos was in Paris. Very slightly, and, for Novak, honestly, probably insignificantly so. He's dealt with, being the favorite for most of his career. But for Carlos Alcaraz, I think that affords him the ability to, in his own mind, see himself as the underdog here, and as a result, come out in a more free mindset. And that's a big part why I think Alcaraz here is going to put in a better match than he did in Paris, even before the cramps. And in the macro sense, as these two have separated themselves from the rest of the field this year, with Novak going for a potential calendar Grand Slam for the second time in 3 years, it definitely looks like this is going to be the guy, health permitting, who's going to be the chief rival contesting slams for the remainder of his career, pretty much. And with what happened in Paris, buoyed by him winning here, any mental upper hand he can get, any scar tissue he can create, that's huge for his cause in winning as much as he can in the twilight of his career. And for Alcaraz, if he's able to pull off what seems like the impossible, in a career that's already fast-tracked so many of the milestones and this year's fast-tracked figuring out the grass, you've got to wonder if we're close to him, taking that best player in the world moniker for himself. Because if he can clear the Djokovic hurdle on grass, it's hard to imagine he wouldn't be able to do it anywhere else. This is the surface where Novak, at this point probably has the biggest buffer between himself and the field. And tomorrow's match can be a litmus test of, how close next up on this surface is. But all of that implication stuff is just, for us nerds. It's not really consequential in what's going to happen in this match, I would think. As far as my prediction, I do think that we are in for the barn burner of a match we were anticipating in Paris here tomorrow. It's hard for me to see anything more one-sided than a tight 4 sets. That was my prediction at the beginning of the tournament, Djokovic over Alcaraz in a tight 4. But Alcaraz's Wimbledon run has impressed me so much. I think he's taken that momentum from Queens and gone one better with it. Both guys have navigated, some tricky hurdles along their way to the final, and I think they've been really impressive in doing so. Carlos Alcaraz's grass campaign this year has gone above and beyond, and his performance has impressed me to the point where I'm going to give him more credit than I did in my prediction before the tournament. And pre-tournament, I thought he was going to surprise a lot of people with the type of match he could give a Djokovic. His employment of all his variety on this surface has been, pretty much perfection. But ultimately here on grass, I'm going to have to see you unseat the king before I'm ready to take that leap. I was comfortable doing so in Paris. I probably would be comfortable doing it at the US Open. Here, though, Djokovic definitely deserves the benefit of the doubt. The guy just has so many ways to beat you at this point, and for Alcaraz to win, he'll have to play the match of his life, something that he's capable of doing, something I feel more comfortable saying he's capable of doing, especially after his performance this tournament. But even with that, there's a possibility you put your best foot forward, and it's not enough against this guy. So for one more year, I'm going to roll with Novak Djokovic, and I'm going to say he gets this done in 5. But yeah, strap in, folks. You should be in for a hell of a final. May the best man win, and I will see y'all in the next one.